Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Fagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com and also recently featured at theringer.com. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. You say that like I have a byline at the Ringer, which is not precisely the case.
Not accurate. Just heavily cited in a fantastic piece that we will discuss a little bit more later. But a lot of people had pointed out the discussion that broke out after Mitch Trubisky's horrible, no good, very bad game to open the season, and the discussion on throwing left. And I was quite amused to see all of these people send in messages like, hey, did you see Arif's thing on? Hey, Arif, did you see that you were cited on? Like,
right.
No, Arif doesn't care for mentions. Arif doesn't care for any of these things.
Oh,
Arif is only in it for
I'm not even on Twitter all that often, honestly.
No, really not. I mean, it's difficult to get a hold of you on Twitter too. I mean, it's to get into some form of an argument with you on Twitter is almost unspeakable.
Oh yeah, it's just uncouth.
Beneath you for sure.
Oh yeah.
Welcome to another episode of Norse Code. I'm back.
Yeah, you're not dead, right?
I'm not dead.
Okay.
This is not a bunch of clips that were recorded previously and then pieced together by Dusty. Also, I'm not podcasting under duress, nor am I blinking SOS into some camera somewhere. No, I am back. I had a bad tooth, and I was a bit too drugged up to give Vikings takes, which, in retrospect, I probably could have made the show.
That doesn't
or at least
change the quality of the show, does it?
Not particularly. It just would have meant my volume on my takes would have been louder and probably more distracting. Like, can the Vikings buy back the Wizinator and put it in Egan where it belongs? Like that sort of thing. It just wouldn't end up coming out right. So, but I am back, and we will be doing another 3-man pod here soon. Dusty is on assignment today. He normally will be doing the Thursday shows or Thursday Friday shows rather, where we are previewing the next week's game. So we are back. We will be discussing lots of things, including the decisive victory over the Falcons. The first half of that game could not have been worse for Atlanta, other than like Julio Jones going down with an ACL. Like the first half of that was ugly for them, and the Vikings were victorious. We will also be looking at the division because Chicago and Green Bay had a terrible game to start the season, which led to all sorts of wonderful questions. And then Detroit managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory and ended up getting a tie out of it somehow. So I feel like they didn't really snatch it. They just kind of got bit.
Right.
Just weirdness all around. But we'll be talking about that and the mailbag as well. But first, before we get into the show, just want to thank you guys so much for listening and helping out in any way that you can, whether you just share links on social media for the show or whether or not you are one of our Patreon subscribers at patreon.com/norsecode, where you can donate to the show, either $1 a month, $3.50 to help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay. I did listen to last week's show where there was a donation involving $3.50 and then $20 to slap Dusty. I promise that money will go into good hands, the hand of a or the face of a recently slapped Dusty, something like that. Also, if you'd like to donate to the show in just a one-time amount, you can go to paypal.me/norsecode as well. So if you'd like to donate to the show, you can do so that way. Otherwise, please continue to spread the word on Facebook, on Twitter, whatever. Just mention Norse Code to a friend or another Vikings listener and just and have a little bit of fun with it. Also, I just wanted to let you guys know that the first attack on the kickers has begun. There was a fantastic miss by Adam Vinatieri this weekend in the Norse Code Fantasy League, where it is -25 points for a missed extra point. And Adam Vinatieri missed and one of the teams in the league had him, and it did very much negatively affect his score. It was a darn shame. But the end of the New Orleans game had a couple of people clenched up a bit too.
Yeah,
so
that was because I think Fairburn was drafted in at least one of the leagues, and I know Vinatieri was drafted in both leagues, right?
Vinatieri was actually only in one. I checked that. Which surprised me because I thought I had picked up Vinatieri at some point. Every time a kicker misses in the NFL, I assume I have him, and most times I'm not like all that wrong. So,
well, in the league that he was picked earlier than the last round. I do remember that.
Yes. So the fact that he wasn't picked in one of the leagues is kind of amazing, actually. But yeah, he is losing and will likely end up losing his game as a result of that. Wow, just looking at the score, I'm disturbed at how well Don from Ohio did this week. I mean, you have Patrick Mahomes and you have Kamara and Mac from Indianapolis, and that sort of thing will happen, but still. Oh, and Keenan Allen as well. And Sammy Watkins. He is he's going to win one game this year and then absolutely nothing. But I was happy to beat you, Arif. So I mean, I'm thrilled personally.
We don't know what the final stats. The corrections come in on Tuesday. I could get 10 more points somewhere, so you don't know that.
I mean, you won't, but it is important for you to believe that. So. All things involving that aside, let's talk about a decisive victory by Minnesota. And if you need fuel for the rest of the season, just rewatch the first quarter or even just the first 5 minutes of this game, because that should be enough to get you to run through a wall. The Vikings had a fantastic start. They were up 14-0 within what seemed like 3 or 4 minutes into the first quarter, and did very well in the run game. I guess the first thing I want to mention in regards to the game is actually regarding the run, and was this more of a schematic thing by Zimmer and Kubiak and Stefanski, or was this simply the Atlanta Falcons just not being ready at all for Dalvin Cook?
I think it's like a lot of things, right? So obviously there's like a fair bit of luck involved. Like even if you're the best, in the NFL at designing and crafting special team strategies and units and stuff like that, to get a punt block on like the very first punt, that takes a lot of luck, a lot of skill from the players and the coaches, but a lot of luck. So that plays a part. I think that the fact that Atlanta is pretty soft when it comes to their edge defenders, which is something we kind of identified going into the game, made it easy for the Vikings to continuously bounce runs to the outside. So there was kind of just a schematic advantage that the Vikings were able to take better advantage of. And it also made it easy for Kyle Rudolph to take on these defensive ends while Brian O'Neill or Riley Reif are like crashing down on the 3 technique on Grady Jarrett to take him out of the play. So the design of the runs was kind of uniquely situated to remove Atlanta's biggest strengths and expose their biggest weaknesses in the run game. But also, I mean, you've got a bevy of weapons to kind of throw to now that Dalvin Cook is kind of one of those weapons. And it made it just fairly simple for Cousins, who was able to benefit from a lot of, after catch work from Thielen on that touchdown and so on. And then also like the defense, they bailed themselves out of the penalties that they committed early. And getting on third down and crafting the pressure that they did with a lot of forcing the 5-man protection to defend 5 players so they couldn't get any double teams. I mean that all is a big part of kind of the schematic advantages the Vikings put together. And I mean they faced a Dirk Ketter Falcons before. We talked about it on the last episode in the preview that Ketter was previously an offensive coordinator for the Falcons, and so the Vikings were pretty familiar with what this offense would look like. I'm kind of surprised that the Falcons weren't familiar with the defense, although they did do some new stuff on defense that we haven't quite seen that many times.
It was really impressive to watch the defense put the Vikings offense in great field position, like twice in a row. And if you're going to be able to do that, we are going to be able to be in a much better position to win these games. The first possession that we had, was within like the 20-25?
Yeah, so that makes it kind of like this interesting question about the offense, right? Because they had like sixth place in like their 2 scoring drives between them. And a lot of it was obviously because of, remarkably short field positions. So, it created the perfect scenario to get kind of the ball rolling early.
And it's kind of hard to judge the passing game at this point simply because Kirk Cousins only threw, 10 passes? So it's kind of hard to really gauge how the passing game is doing, but we can say that Dalvin Cook had a monster game.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Large sample size on the running game, I suppose, right? That's kind of the concurrent fact. It's interesting. He only, in theory, broke, I think, like 3 tackles, right? Like, if you take a look at kind of the PFF stats for breaking tackles. And they tend to count, I think their definition requires like a defender to get a hand on you. So it's like contact, right? And then that's when you get to break a tackle. So if you force someone to miss and they're tackling air, they don't even touch you, that doesn't count as a broken tackle, right? And he didn't actually even have that much of that. There was a bunch of kind of really well executed run blocking, a lot of different types of running. I think I expected to see a lot of wide zone, just wide zone, inside zone, wide zone, inside zone as the primary runs. But we saw a lot of stuff. We saw a split zone. We saw a play I broke down for The Athletic. I ran it by like 3 different high school coaches, and they couldn't identify it or name the play. I called it a pin and pull because that's typically the zone run associated with pulling a player, plus they had some backside cuts. It's not a pin and pull. Someone called it a power sweep. Someone called it a counter sweep. Someone just called it a power with backside cuts, which they had never seen before. It was very unusual. It was kind of cool, and that's what scored the 19-yard touchdown. So they did a bunch of different stuff in the run game that really attacked the 3 technique. It attacked Grady Jarrett. And so that really opened up the running game for Dalvin Cook, who, again, he individually performed very, very well. But the offensive game plan put him in a bunch of really good positions. And then Zimmer mentioned after the game that, some of these runs were actually designed to go on the inside, and he bounced them outside. And obviously he was making some pretty great decisions there. So all around, just a pretty great setup, right? Because I think, and then Cook played well individually. I think the tackles played well as run blockers. I thought Kyle Rudolph, who, you're not going to hear me praise Kyle Rudolph that much for run blocking. I've always felt that was a weakness of his. I thought he did remarkably well as a run blocker in this game. CJ Ham, who I've been a little critical of this preseason, had a remarkably good game as a run blocker. So you've got some individual performances by some of your tertiary blockers, not necessarily the interior blockers, and then just really excellent design by Kubiak or Stefanski or Dennison or whoever's kind of in charge of the run game design.
So, quick question, because you had said something really interesting, and I just want to expound on that for just a moment. You had mentioned that Zimmer had discussed how those runs were kind of designed for right down the middle or for inside, and instead that Cook was taking him outside. Is that the sort of thing that you expect to have him kind of be reined in on, or is it the sort of situation where if he continues to have success, that he should be able to have a little bit more free reign on that?
Yeah, well, I think that's something that they're just going to continue to let him make judgment calls on. Some running backs, when they come out of college, and this is actually an issue I had with Mike Boone coming out of college, they'll try to run it outside again and again and again, especially if they're, faster, more athletic, because they know they can beat defensive ends to the edge. And the problem, of course, is that you massively increase the risk. You're much more likely to have a 4-yard loss if you're bouncing to the outside, you're bouncing back and arcing around, than if you're going to run up the middle. So, that's and if it becomes a tendency, obviously teams can key in on it and make those losses more likely and make the explosive gains that come from that kind of strategy less likely. But even in this game, when we saw the Vikings in 3rd and short and they run the ball on 3rd and short, Dalvin did have opportunities to bounce it outside, and he chose not to. He chose to stay inside because he knew that 2 yards was better than an unknown risk between -4 and 4, right? Because it was 3rd and 2. So I think that they're pretty happy with his decision making, and I don't think that there's going to be any kind of discussion like, hey, good job, but that's not always going to be there next time. Kind of like pulling Joe Webb aside and being like, well, great job on the 80-yard run. That's not always going to be there. It's not quite the same thing. I think that with his decision making, generally speaking, they're pretty happy with what he did.
So let's talk about the defense just a little bit. And Mackenzie Alexander, who had a hell of a first half before his elbow was dislocated. But he played a tremendous role in just how quickly the Vikings were able to run up the score.
Yeah. Before he got injured, he did a really great job, especially in run defense. I mean, sometimes they took Jaron Kearse or put Jaron Kearse in and took Mackenzie Alexander out. And he also did a pretty great job in run defense. But, being able to stop them at the line of scrimmage, the Falcons, like Zimmer mentioned, kind of abandon the run early and have to throw the ball. And given the fact that they weren't all that successful running the ball and that they got down quickly, it became pretty obvious from down to down to down that they would just throw the ball. And so that's when, of course, you need kind of your slot corners and your outside corners and all that to really clamp down. And we know the Falcons to have a fairly deep receiver core. We talked about that last week, of course. But, and also some players that we weren't even all that interested in, like Russell Gage, would show out. So, we were interested in Calvin Ridley, Mohamed Sanu, and Justin Hardy. Even then, I mean, Mackenzie Alexander, who he lined up against, they didn't have a great day in the slot. And so the fact that he continues to produce and continues to be good is part of a super encouraging pattern with the Vikings where, these corners that have disappointed their rookie year and in their second year and don't even start out their third year all that well, turn it around partway through the third year. With Trey Waynes, it was almost exactly halfway through the third year. With Mackenzie Alexander, it was a little bit earlier. And then you kind of ask at the end of that third year, well, how sustainable is that? And for Waynes, it looks like it's been sustainable. He had maybe, 1 or 2 bad plays in the game where he'd wanted to take that back and turn his head around, but mostly was very good. Plus he forced the fumble. And then also Mackenzie Alexander thus far, obviously we're only 1 game into this 4th year, but thus far is kind of playing up to what that would look like. So really tremendous game from him. And I think he'll continue to be kind of one of these underrated performers. I'm glad you brought him up because we're gonna, no matter what, everyone's gonna talk about Anthony Harris, right? We're gonna talk about Danielle Hunter. We might talk about Anthony Barr. We're definitely gonna talk about Xavier Rhodes, right? But until you get your complementary pieces to work well, because defense, especially in protection situations like cornerbacks, right? Defense is often about, what your weakest link can do. And so if you've got all these complementary pieces working really well together, and hopefully Alexander, his injury, it doesn't take them out for too long. I heard, some Twitter doctor, I have no idea what the credibility is, but dislocated elbow 4 weeks. Hopefully, he's not out for too long because, his performance was really good until he had to leave the game.
Yeah, exactly. So now that we've kind of got some of the major stars out of the way, let's talk about Kirk Cousins. And I say that simply because Kirk Cousins had 100 yards passing, 107 if I want to be technical, I suppose. He might not get to 4,000 yards this year, which is kind of the barometer of whether or not he has a decent season. But the passing game, it seemed like a major afterthought. If this was the game where it was revealed that this is what Zimmer wants to do moving forward, I don't think anyone would have necessarily disagreed with it. Right. Was the choice to go with this many runs as opposed to passing due to the amount of points that we were up and we were just trying to kill the clock, or was this something else?
I think it really is more the clock situation. Zimmer after the game was like, look, I know everybody wants to talk about how much I want to run the ball, but honestly, there was no reason to pass because we were up by 28 points. I mean, paraphrasing, right? But like, his argument was it was just the situation in the game, right? You're averaging kind of like 5 yards, 7.5 yards a carry at the end of the first half, and you're up by 28 points at the beginning of the third quarter. Why wouldn't you run the ball? Because the Vikings started out passing. I think by the time, I wrote this in the article at The Athletic, by the time Cook ran his 19-yard touchdown, that was the Vikings' second run, and they had over twice as many passes as they had run. So it wasn't as if, they were crafting a statement that they were just going to run the ball. I really honestly think that this has a lot less to do with Zimmer. I wouldn't even say coercing, pressuring, the leaders of the offense to craft a strategy that really has that heavy run emphasis. Because I think as soon as the game situation tilted so considerably, it was just easier to run the ball, and it just kept working anyway, right? So like whatever. But I don't see that going forward unless the Vikings continue to be dominant in the first quarter, which would be great. I mean, I would love to be wrong about this. Unless the Vikings continue to score like 2 touchdowns in the first quarter every game from here on out, I think they're going to pass the ball more than they're going to run the ball, because when the game situation wasn't so tilted, they did pass the ball more than they ran the ball. And, I know that people were like, well, they passed exactly as much as they ran in some of these preseason games. But the preseason games, like I think that, they know that the quarterback is the most important position. At a fundamental level, they do know that passing is more efficient than running. Maybe not quite to the extreme that me or a lot of people in the analytics community believe, but they're aware, right? And so I don't think that that's going to be kind of the plan going forward. He was even asked a couple of times after the game, like, hey, this seems like kind of your ideal kind of football, right? Defense and running the ball, and the quarterback only gets to throw the ball 10 times. And he's like, well, chill. He was like, this is such a weird situation. It kind of is not what you should expect going forward. So I would expect the Vikings in most games to pass more than they run.
Yeah, and for those, which is good news for those who drafted, say, Adam Thielen or Stephon Diggs, and we're just sitting there on Sunday like, well, the Vikings won, but they didn't do anything. Like, it was just a little bit odd, which kind of makes analyzing things like the offensive line a little bit difficult, because it would appear that the run blocking was doing fairly well, but you couldn't tell anything in the way of like pass blocking or pass protection, which might have something to do with the fact that there were a couple of real eye-popping grades out there from PFF.
Yeah, people are pretty upset. I saw some people being like, oh, Bradbury got a 35, which, by the way, is, for people kind of uninitiated with PFF, is one of the worst grades I've ever seen for any player at any position. Like, that's insane. 60 is bad. Like, it's catastrophically bad. And, 54 is kind of where the worst Vikings offensive lineman ended at the year. 35 is obscene. But I'll say this. So he was poor as both a run blocker. This is Garrett Bradbury, by the way. He was poor as both a run blocker and a pass protector, but he had 11 pass blocking reps, I want to say, because there's 10 passes and a sack. 11 pass blocking reps. And the way that the PFF premium stats, so his grade in whatever their back end is, where they still kind of use the plus minus system, is probably a little bit different than what his grade looks like in this public facing system. They weight pass blocking more regardless of kind of how much you throw or run. And I could be wrong, but I'm pretty confident that that's the way it's done. And so his worst pass blocking grade is dragging down his below average run blocking grade. And the thing is, I think they only logged him as giving up one pressure. But here's also the thing. If you give up a pressure for once every 11 snaps, because there's only 11, right? So at a 9% clip, if I'm doing math okay, like 9.1%, you're the worst offensive lineman in the NFL. So I mean, that's bad, right? Like that's it. So you give up 1 in 11, and that's catastrophically bad. And that's the thing is, the grade isn't just built off of that either. It's also built off of plays where he might have lost the rep as a pass protector, but the pressure didn't arrive either because they got rid of the ball quickly, or Kirk was in a moving pocket, or someone else picked up that lineman or defender, and that'll happen. And that occurred too, where he got pushed back into the pocket, he got bullied into the pocket, and Kirk had to scramble. It wasn't really a pressure per se, but it was a play where he lost. So that's a concern. And the problem, of course, is that with 11 pass blocking reps, 10 attempts, there's nothing that you can discern that tells you that, this is, what it is going forward. I mean, even when we get like a game with 30 pass blocking reps, that you still say, well, it's one game, right? Like when Tom Compton was having a pretty decent start to the year, and then he just got eviscerated by Aaron Donald, you're like, well, that's one game. He's doing a lot better than we thought. And then he got injured, and then he came back, and he was awful. But, for those first like 6 or 8 games, absent Aaron, I mean, he was good. And if you'd only judged him by one game, you'd have either expected him to be an above average guard or the worst guard in the league. And the truth was that he was neither. So, normal games have sample size problems. This game has an abysmal sample size problem. But I will say the depth to which Garrett Bradbury got beat on these run blocks. And the thing is, people are saying, I don't trust Zimmer. The run game was good. The first round rookie, was highlighted, and he was fairly highlighted for a bunch of the good stuff that he did by the broadcast team, and then on Twitter by people I respect a lot, like Brandon Thorne, for example, offensive line guys. They highlighted some of Bradbury's excellent plays, and they're like, well, these guys, they do offensive line work, and I can see with my eyes because of what they're showing me that Bradbury played well. So I don't trust PFF. And the thing is, PFF has offensive line guys. They go to these offensive line and defensive line camps that are being held by like Von Miller and Duke Manyweather. And I know there's like this like kind of public beef between, offensive line Twitter and PFF, but they do collaborate actually a lot more than people think. There's even, they've been on podcasts with each other where they kind of agree that the differences in the way that they approach things are actually very minute. And then a legendary offensive line coach, Paul Alexander, works and he like coached like Willie Anderson with the Bengals. He coached some Hall of Fame offensive linemen, right? And he works with PFF to make sure that everything, and then he used PFF grades when he was game planning. So you give them more credit, I think, is what I'm trying to get across, because I identified during the game that I thought Bradbury was underperforming and no one was really talking about it. And then, of course, afterwards, the grade comes out and people are like, wow, PFF, what are you talking about? And then Zimmer says in the presser on Monday, today, as we're recording, so we recorded on Monday, he said in that presser that, Bradbury, had a lot of defenders backdoor him, right? And that's got to be cleaned up. So there's a lot there to say, he's got a lot to work on. Again, one game, Grady Jarrett was who he was up against. There seems to be kind of like this, like, well, he went up against Grady Jarrett. Is this like a concern? Like, is it really, Grady Jarrett's really good? And I agree, Grady Jarrett's kind of one of the more underrated defensive tackles. We don't really talk about, this guy that much unless we're playing him, right? But there's so many good defensive tackles. So Grady Jarrett gets washed away. But that's the flip side of the problem. There are so many good defensive tackles. And Grady Jarrett's not the best one the Vikings will play. They've got Akeem Hicks coming up twice. They've got Damon Harrison coming up twice. They've got Kenny Clark coming up twice. They've got Fletcher Cox. All of those players are definitely better in my eyes than Grady Jarrett, right? And then they've also got, a bunch of fairly good players. Chris Jones, who I think might be better. You've got Poona Ford for Seattle. He's a nose tackle that's been performing well above kind of expectation. You've got in the next 15 games, at least 9 or 10 of them have defensive tackles that are as good as or more often better than Grady Jarrett. And in some of these games, it's the star, then the nose tackle, and then their backup that's comparable to Grady Jarrett. So like Chicago, who they're going to play twice, right? They've got Akeem Hicks they got to deal with. They've also got to deal with nose tackle Eddie Goldman, who's phenomenal. And then the backup, Roy Robertson Harris, was a PFF Secret Superstar last year and did crazy well against Green Bay. So, okay, he doesn't perform well against good defensive tackles. Well, I've got some bad news. So, there's like a back and forth here where you want to say, don't panic because it was 10 or 11 pass blocking snaps and it's the first game and he's a rookie. Like a good example is actually, who they just played, the Falcons. I think this happened to both Alex Mack when he was with the Browns and Jake Matthews with the Falcons. They had awful rookie years. And they turned into some really high-level players. Alex Mack, for a while, was one of the best centers in the NFL, and he's still playing at a very high level. And Jake Matthews is a very, very good offensive tackle. So, I'm not saying hit the panic button or anything like that. I think even Tyron Smith struggled as rookie. So, but I will say, for this year, that gives us more information than we've ever had. I don't think the preseason told us that he was playing really well. In fact, I think the preseason told us there was some stuff he had to work on. And then the best data we have is this very small sample of the first game. And it's not great data. So don't panic, but I would say there's more concern than anything else, which we're coming off a 28-12 win, which was much better than the score implied. It was really more of a 28-6 win. So I don't want to be like, yeah, the Vikings are secretly bad, you idiots. Obviously, they played really well, and this is a sign that the team is ready to compete and even exceed kind of the 10 wins I predicted before the season started, and that's great. But when I talk about concerns, I don't want them to be washed away by the fact that they played well, because sometimes the concerns kind of pop up later, like with Case Keenum or whoever, right?
Well, since you're going to start being negative, I think we should start being negative in general on the team. Really, for performance.
They could push for 11 wins. This is a good team.
Well, let's nitpick a bit,
okay?
Because
sure.
The penalties were getting a bit much, and seemed like the only way for a while that Atlanta was able to move the ball.
Yeah, one of the first things that Zimmer brought up, which of course he did, right? One of the first things that Zimmer brought up was the penalties, right? Like unprompted. We didn't ask before, we asked any questions at the presser. He was like, hey, great game. I thought Kirk did really well. I thought Dalvin ran the ball well. Defense, I thought, mostly they did pretty good. Penalties, man, you got to clean those up. Dumb mistakes. It's just like, okay. Which, Belichick does the same thing. When he, whooped Tennessee, by 58 points or whatever, or when he, housed someone, some, opening weekend, maybe it was Miami, one of the few games where the Patriots really took it to Miami. It was, week one, and he was like, gotta get better. We cannot play like this next week, otherwise we're not going to walk away with a win. And it's like, you won by, 30 points. What are you talking about? And Zimmer's kind of the same way, right? He's probably softer around the edges, which is a very rare thing to say about Zimmer, because he was like, hey, congrats on the win. But whereas Bill Belichick was like, man, I can't believe the way you guys played. But Zimmer's like, congrats on the win, but we got to clean these up. Otherwise, they're going to come back to bite us. So, yeah, the penalties were a big concern. Obviously some of the penalties, defensive pass interference, I maintain that Waynes did not interfere on that play. And Zimmer brought up after the presser. So this was interesting to me because I 100% agree with him on this one. The replay angles that they had were just the one camera angle on Waynes, and that camera angle does not have enough definitive evidence to say whether or not it was pass interference. I would say if you look at it, seems more likely that it is pass interference than not. But inside the stadium, they were playing a replay that to me made it look very clear. It was the reverse end, which is what Zimmer was talking about, from the end zone or something, where it was not pass interference. It was very clear to me. And that is the replay angle Zimmer used to challenge the play. So I thought he was right. Plus, I was watching it live with binoculars and stuff, and live it didn't look like PI, but that's less interesting than the replay because I get to actually take a deeper look. And on the stadium replay, it didn't look like pass interference. So that's the stuff. It doesn't bother me as much, right? The neutral zone infractions, holy crap. Which a combination of offsides and neutral zone infractions. You had one on Hercules Mataafa, and then he also later got a hand to the face. You had a one on Everson, because of course you do. You just got to chalk that one up. You got one on Anthony Barr, and one on someone else, I want to say. And then you also had another illegal hands to the face on, I think in the stadium they called it J-Ron curse, but people were saying it was on Wayne's. And that's the challenge that Zimmer threw to get it to the 20 instead of to have it at the 1. So, yeah, those defensive penalties allowed Atlanta to kind of move the ball down the field. They didn't do much with that, though, which was nice. But if you take the penalty plays out, which is typically what's done in these statistics, so you don't have to like manually do it, the Vikings were, again, very good on third down. But the Atlanta continued to get first downs by penalties. So they're going to want to clean that up against an opponent that's maybe a little bit more prepared or cohesive. I expect Atlanta by the middle of the season is going to look like a really good team. So that's going to make the win look really good in the rearview mirror. So yeah, I think going forward, that's certainly a concern, especially because I think if you get rid of Mataafa's 2 penalties, I think he largely had a pretty good game. I don't think his PFF grade's very good. I don't know how much of that is penalty, but I think he had a good game from what I saw and what I rewatched. He had 3 or so pressures, and Zimmer mentioned that it would have been nice if he finished any of them, but pressures are good. But the penalties, I think really drug down his overall performance, because whatever impact he makes on those pressures, if you have 5 pressures and 1 penalty, good chance the 1 penalty is more impactful. Like that's how significant those, especially on third down. So they really do have to clean up those penalties. The first couple of years in the league, Zimmer had one of the least penalized defensive units, and it's kind of grown a little bit since then.
There was a moment during I believe it was the fourth quarter, but there was a moment where a penalty wiped out an Everson Griffin sack. And the look on Griffin's face, just like, of all the people on the team that you could have done that to, right, you did it and wiped out Everson Griffin's sack. And the look on his face was just one of, well, I'm gonna kill you as soon as we get to the locker room. How dare you take away my sack? Like, he just looked absolutely infuriated.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, especially because he had such a remarkable game. I mean, he at least had 1 official sack, right? Would have been nice to have the 2, really nice, plus a couple of pressures and hits. But like, yeah, it just would have been such a nice capper for the game for him.
Yeah. Let's also talk a little bit about the. I'll switch it up a little bit. Xavier did not play the entire game. He went out briefly and then came back. So the Vikings season seemed to officially start at 12:31.
Right. Yeah.
I guess, I don't know. Like it seems like this, and you do this enough times and you start to think, okay, well, is this some sort of a pattern, like you get burned and this is the first thing you do? Or is this just, the nagging hamstring injury that will forever exist in every game that he plays from here on out?
Right, yeah. The thing is, he played remarkably, but the injury occurred early. So, like, that kind of, like, creates a filter for, like, the rest of the game. And it ended up being, like a 13-yard gain to... Justin Hardy or something like that? A 14-yard gain to Sanu. 13-yard gain to Russell Gage. That's it. It was early and Xavier's limping and Russell Gage gets 13 yards and a first down. You're like, oh, here we go. And I was concerned, right? Because we'd just seen him get burned in the preseason by Damiere Byrd. And the question is like, oh, is he going to be healthy enough to play a whole season, and has age already caught up to him where he doesn't have the speed to compete with high-level receivers? And it turns out, no, I guess. He did extremely well. He did a great job shutting down Julio, who, when Rhodes was covering him, did not get any yards with Rhodes in coverage. I mean, even with Curse in coverage, like Julio got 11 yards on Curse, and 6 yards on Barr and 10 yards on Wayne. So it's not like he got a ton on anyone else, but he got 0 yards on Xavier, and Xavier obviously followed him a lot more than anyone else did. So, props to Rhodes for creating another Julio Jones Vikings misery. Has he ever gotten above 50 yards against the Vikings? I mean, it's been.
I'm starting to think no.
Yeah, it's.
I've seen at least 3 games where he plays the Vikings, and each game he's just shut down.
Yeah, he definitely averages under 50. He averages something like 40, 42 or something like that. But yeah, I mean, he just got shut down, and a lot of that has to do with Rhodes. But Rhodes, I mean, he also ended up in assignments on tight ends just because of the way the zone rules worked. He ended up in assignments on Justin Hardy and Russell Gage, like I said, and the Gage one we already talked about. But we gave up 9 yards outside of that injury one to Gage. So I mean, he had a really remarkable game. The longest gain he gave, it looks like PFF, 10 yards total is the longest gain. No, the longest gain was 10 yards. So there was a 0 yard game, play too. Was 10 yards, and he allowed 3 receptions aside from that. So 2 receptions aside from that. So just really just a great game, and I think a really big part of why that offense couldn't be in sync. Because I think the thing that matters the most here is that Julio wasn't targeted that much when Rhodes was on him, and deterring targets in the first place. I mean, you've got to be an incredible coverage to stop Matt Ryan from trusting Julio, right? So, yeah, from what I saw, because sometimes I would just, instead of taking a look at the pocket, I would just take a look at the Julio Rhodes matchup. And yeah, I just crushed him. It was great.
Fantastic. Is there anything else that we should talk about before we move on?
Like Anthony Harris?
Well, we could talk about Anthony Harris. Let's talk about Anthony Harris.
Player of the game, right? 2 interceptions, fumble recovery, no mistakes. So, you end up with a bunch of highlights and 0 lowlights, I think. And the thing is, Harrison Smith had a really remarkable game, but I mean, Anthony Harris just crushed it. I mean, he got targeted twice. No, he got targeted once because the interception on Julio was not technically a target on him. So he got targeted once for 0 yards, ends up getting an interception on his target too, ends up getting a bunch of stops as a run defender or as a flat defender, ends up just being in the right place at the right time, reading his keys, getting to move really quickly, and just was never out of position. And what was interesting is that Simmer said, today, again, day of recording, he was asked hey, so how much of that is Anthony Harris just kind of being in the right position at the right time? Because a lot of interceptions, right position at the right time, good hands. And how much of that is him kind of just moving to make the play? And both times, that he got the interception, Zimmer said that he had to really kind of book it and get out of his assignment and go to where he knew he needed to be in order to make the play, and he did. So really remarkable stuff. Obviously, the other interception was the one in the end zone. Daniil Hunter had pressure. Ben Gideon was covering the flat. And so Matt Ryan is either throwing it away or throwing it to the tight end that Waynes is covering, and Waynes just comes down with it. So player of the game, if there is one, obviously with an effort like this tremendous from all 3 phases, you could say you could give it to Cook, you could give it to Brian O'Neill. I mean, you could give it to a lot of people, and there's a pretty good argument for it. But yeah, I mean, Harris, I think, had the most impactful plays. So just really remarkable stuff. Continuing to play better than Harrison Smith, as he did for the second half of last year.
Harrison Smith did have one play that really made me smile during the game where he pushed a guy for a force out.
Yeah, great
and it
play.
almost looked like he was crowd surfing him out.
Yes.
I'm convinced if you play the replay back, the guy went up instead of just to the side. I thoroughly enjoyed that. So that is going to be it for discussing. Oh, and I suppose Dan Bailey hit all his kicks.
Yeah, hey, glad we don't have to talk about it because it means he made all his kicks.
He made all his kicks. All appears to be good in this particular postal district, so we are going to move on and not go in depth on kickers and punters necessarily. Although to say that Colquitt had a pretty decent couple of punts.
Yeah, I just checked. Somehow he had 5. How did he have 5 punts? Whatever. He averaged.
There were 3 and outs in the 3 and out. Remember when the Vikings were like running like 3 times in a row?
Oh, for no good reason? Yeah, right in the top of the third quarter. Yeah, great hang time on the punts. Averaged 50 yards or so on a 49.4 yards. Gross ended up only having like 40.2 net yards, looks like, but one of them was inside the 20s. So pretty good day. Despite a high return rate, ended up creating enough hang time for Jaron Curse, and then later a different gunner.
That seemed like a lot more. That seemed like a lot more of a situation of just overshooting, like the gunners just overshooting their target.
Yeah, I think so. What was interesting is that Curse would consistently beat the jammer, get out, get to the area, and then miss a tackle. But most of the time, Mike Boone, that was the other gunner that ended up in that same situation. Most of the time, those punt returners will waive the fair catch because there's no one blocking this like 6'5" dude who's bearing down on me. So most of the time they'll just waive the fair catch. So most of the time it's fine, but you do have to make those tackles.
Yeah, just a little bit. The punts, and I only mention him because he is new to the team, and it was worth mentioning because he was doing an adequate job as a punter.
Like he said, the city deserves good punting.
Exactly. He was doing an adequate job, and it seemed like the returns were coming back and didn't appear to be the fault of him not giving enough hang time or not enough time for the gunners to catch up. It seemed like the gunners were just a bit. They just weren't on target. They just weren't quite there yet. But we have plenty of games to work on that, so we can do a quick look at the division. Because all of a sudden, the top 2 teams in the division are Minnesota and Green Bay. I mentioned Minnesota because we were actually able to score points, as opposed to Green Bay, who were barely able to get, was it 10? Did they get 10 points or did they get more?
10.
Was it? Yeah, 10 points.
They covered the spread with 10 points.
Good for them. Let's talk a little bit about the Chicago Green Bay game because this was ugly, and it was disgusting. Fun to watch from a certain perspective. This was really fun to watch because it involved Aaron Rodgers getting his teeth knocked in and getting super frustrated to the point where you thought that, like, I'm sure the only time he gets this frustrated is when he gets something like a Christmas card from his family. Like it manages to make it through the filter. Yeah. He ends up getting that and looking at grr. But he was slamming his helmet and slamming his fist on the ground. Like he was getting beat up by this great Chicago defense. The problem being is that if you are able to get Green Bay to stay at 10 points, you have to produce and take advantage of that. Green Bay seems to have spent the last few days going, yeah, we beat Chicago. Chicago's got this great defense. Like, yeah, Chicago apparently also doesn't have an offense, which leads me to the discussion from The Ringer that you were so heavily cited on, where they were trying to decide whether or not Trubisky can actually throw left, and their conclusion wasn't that he necessarily couldn't throw left, it's that he is throwing the ball to begin with.
Right. So, or I should say correct, rather. First, love to be cited in national publication, The Ringer. That is so funny to me. This has like become like a thing. So, in a world where I've definitely gotten in their heads. So let's presuppose, right? Let's presuppose.
In a world where Arif has definitely got inside their head.
Let's presuppose I'm inside Matt Nagy and or Mitch Trubisky's head. I'm living rent-free, right? This is kind of what that would look like, because they started the game, they're scripted plays, and I know Nagy uses scripted plays. It's part of kind of the coaching school he's a part of. Their scripted plays included a lot of throws to the left, and then he didn't throw to the left for a really large chunk of the game. And then he throws to the left again, Allen Robinson, 27 yards, great. And then he throws to the left again, Allen Robinson, I believe it's another completion, maybe 15 yards. And then he doesn't throw left for a while. And then he throws left at the end of the game for the takes. It was, I am such a big fan of this version of Mitchell Trubisky. Like, that forced leftward throw for the interception, I tweeted out, I can't breathe. And that was, I couldn't. I was like, oh, what? I couldn't have scripted this. It would have just been like, Arif, stop writing like weird revenge fan fiction.
Like, this is what Arif, why Chelsea's trying to get you to bed, and like, Arif, please close the laptop and stop writing your Mitch Trubisky fan fiction.
And then Adrian Amos, who they cast off in the offseason, picks them off on the left side of the end zone. Arif, stop.
Nobody came out better from the Chicago Green Bay game than Arif Hassan. That was my takeaway from the weekend.
We knew you wrote the Allen Robinson throws in there just so it made it seem like, because every character has to go through a rough and trying time, the trials and tribulations, right? The low point.
As South Park puts it, this happens, and so this happens.
Yes, exactly. You wrote the Allen Robinson 27-yard catch to create your own personal low point for your Mitch Trubisky can't throw left arc. And then at the very end, the Mitch Trubisky can't throw left meme triumphs against all odds. Like, come on, man. That game can't have happened. I'm imagining it. We're dreaming this podcast right now. I would also explain the Vikings just dominating the Falcons, I guess. But yeah, I mean, he forced some passes to the left. And so the Ringer says, hey, so the evidence is that he just can't throw particularly well, a conclusion that I support. But they also cited the Warren Sharp's sharpfootballstats.com site for his throws to the left versus throws to the right and throws to the center. And well, so in 2017, this was like definitively the case. Like statistically, he had like a 38% completion throwing to the left. Like that's, and to the center right, it was much higher, right? The center slash to the right. It was much higher. His advanced yards per attempt was like 4.7 to the left, and it was much higher to the center and the right, like over 6. And his yards per attempt and his pass rating, all of that was much lower to the left in 2017. Then in 2018, the first 4 games was the same story. And then he played against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and like for a lot of offenses, that solved a lot of problems. But then he continued to play well when he wasn't playing the Buccaneers, at least when he was throwing to the left. And so it seemed like the meme died. But Football Outsiders for 2018 and Sharp Football Stats both found that when he was throwing to his left, he was worse. That's not the same as Pro Football Focus, whose stats I originally used to craft the take, because they're concerned not with from which direction are you throwing, right? So if he's on the left hash and then he throws forward, it looks like a throw to the left in Pro Football Focus, because they're concerned with where the ball ends up. When you throw to the left, it's because you're left with the numbers. But Sharp Football Stats, and I believe Football Outsiders, are more focused on directionally from where you are positioned, is it a throw to the left? And so if he rolls out to the left and throws straight forward, that's not a throw to the left by Football Outsiders and by Sharp Football Stats, but it is by PFF, at least as far as I know. So they both indicate that actually he was worse throwing to the left. which I'm holding on to because that would be tight. That would be really cool if that was the case. I don't have anything against him personally, like I do with Carson Wentz, who
that still has to be based somewhat in like North Dakotan or something.
Right. I mean, Carson Wentz is like a great person, right? Like he's a good guy, but screw him. But
if with one soundbite could sum up your blogging experience.
But which incidentally, there's like apparently he knows that I do. Carson Wentz. So if both Carson Wentz and Mitchell Trubisky are actually aware of this like random dude who I guess now works at the Athletic of all places, it just has this weird vendetta against them. That would be a great trilogy because it's first is Chad Greenway, then it's Carson Wentz, then it's Mitchell Trubisky. But yeah, there's still time, I think, for the throw left narrative to kind of revive itself. As bad as that would be for like this young man's career, who seems to be a nice guy, but I don't think he can throw left. And there's evidence, and now everybody knows.
Now everybody knows. So Chicago turned out to have an offense that was incredibly anemic, to say the very least.
It's an Allen Robinson-centric. It can only work with him.
Yes. The moment that he goes down with an injury, and let's face it, that's coming, that looks like that will derail into something horrible. That defense is scary. That defense is going to be something I don't want to see twice in a year.
Yeah, that defense, I'm certainly worried about the defense. Some people were like, yeah, regression, you got had. And it's like, okay, fair, you get to dunk. It's, if I'm going to dunk on week 1, Mitchell Trubisky, you get to dunk week 1, the defense was good, even though everyone said regression. I get it. But are we sure that, like, Rodgers is consistent? Because, like, obviously he's good when he's on. And sometimes he's on for a while. And it's tremendous. We saw some tremendous stuff. But also, like, I'm not sure he's consistent enough to say that, like, a good defensive performance anymore is a reliable indicator that you've got a good defense. Plus, obviously the Packers' offensive line is kind of in tatters compared to what it was several years ago. But in terms of projecting what it means for the Vikings, same thing, right? I mean, it's not like their offensive line is set. We just talked about kind of the concerns we had. And Cousins may be much more consistent than Rodgers. But I mean, who would you rather have, honestly? So
if you're in a situation where it only takes 4 points to beat you,
yeah,
you're not in a good place.
Yeah. So I mean, the defense is scary. The back end doesn't look as concerning to me as it did last year. And obviously, I mean, that back end is like Clinton Dix and Eddie Jackson and the corners like Fuller and Mukamara and Buster Screen instead of Bryce Callahan, who looked, actually Buster Screen looked pretty good, but that doesn't look as intimidating. It's really that front 4/front 7 that are really scary, but that might just be kind of like a visceral thing because it matters less, right? I mean, the secondary is still good. I'm saying it's not as terrifying, right? It's not like going up against the 2013 Seahawks. In my mind, I could eat crow on this one. Or like the 2015 Broncos secondary was remarkable, right? With Chris Harrison, Aqib Talib, and a good Raheem Moore. It doesn't feel like that, right? Or even last year's Bears. So I think there's opportunities there, but there's a lot of worry just because, I mean, I don't have a ton of regard for Leonard Floyd, but Khalil Mack might be the best edge rusher in the NFL. Really good argument for it. It's like him, J.J. Watt, Von Miller. Then you've got Akeem Hicks, who's one of the best 3 techniques, and you got Eddie Goldman, one of the best nose tackles. It's just a really rough front to deal with. So there's some scary stuff there, but I don't think it'll be as good as next year, despite this like really strong piece of evidence we have from week 1.
And we'll talk more about Green Bay in the next episode, but Green Bay leaves, I have to feel like they left like feeling like a wounded animal at that point because they were beaten up, but they were successful, especially on defense, eking out a 10-3 victory, which if you would have told me that the Packers are going to end up winning that game, great. Rodgers didn't go out hurt, then Rodgers should have had like a 300, 400 yard like passing game. Rodgers certainly did not, and looked absolutely atrocious
especially
in the first half.
Yeah.
Oh God, just absolutely atrocious. Which does end up begging the whole do you need to play in the preseason question, which everyone hates and is super annoying, but it came under fire a lot in week 1.
Yeah. I don't know that any individual offensive player on balance had a good game for Green Bay. And you could say, hey, they're up against the Bears defense, but like, I mean, I've watched good defenses for a while. The Vikings have been good. So like, it's not unusual for me to see a defense completely dominate a good offense. That's happened. But it's pretty rare to see like not one player having a good game after you account for the whole game. That's rough. Obviously, the offensive line had struggles. I would expect David Bakhtiari to bounce back after having to face Khalil Mack. I expect him to have a pretty interesting game against Everson Griffin. And it's always interesting because, I mean, they know each other so well, and it's very clear in the way that they match up that the way that they play each other is not the way that they play, non-divisional opponents. But I mean, that's interesting. But like Lane Taylor, had just an awful game. Billy Turner had an awful game. Corey Linsley, I mean, he's a center, but he didn't, strike me as having a particularly good game. Seems like he got bull rushed, kind of like Bradbury. Maybe not as much, but he also had 40 pass blocking snaps, so maybe that's why. Bulaga had a pretty bad game. The Packers continue to not have tight ends, even though they technically have, fantasy superstars Jimmy Graham and Mercedes Lewis, who, by the way, still in the league. And
I watched that game. That's astonishing. I don't even remember him playing.
Oh, he definitely played. He definitely sucked.
I remember Jimmy Graham. I just didn't remember Mercedes Lewis.
Yeah, so he's a blocking tight end now. That's the thing. Like,
why?
Well, he's not good at it, so that good question.
Well, that's like, okay, well, first off, accurate. Second off, yeah, we don't know either.
But yeah,
sorry, just aside there.
But yeah, I mean, like Aaron Jones struggled. Maybe you could say, hey, Jake Krumero had the one special team snap that was pretty cool. Like I don't know what you can say, but this offense just didn't have. They had really good plays, right? They had a really great play by Robert Tonyan and 2 really great, just phenomenal plays by Aaron Rodgers, and 1 or 2 really good plays from Devontae Adams. But on the whole, it sucked, all of them. So yeah, I mean that's it's going to be fascinating because when. Maybe it's like this is the issue, the opposite of the issue of like evaluating like Lamar Jackson versus a Dolphins defense that like found out they were tanking before the game, kind of like the Vikings playing the Bengals that one time. Is Lamar Jackson that good? No, but is he good? Probably. Is the Packers offense that bad after they play against what seems to be an all-world defense? No, but are they like at issue? Probably. I don't know. It's very weird. The Packers defense did well. That's, Zadarius Smith tied Danielle Hunter for having the most pressures in week 1. So that's cool. The Bears offensive line is actually like fairly good. So, that's the, Zadarius Smith is a concern. Preston Smith, might have played even better than him. He's a concern. Jair Alexander played well. Darnell Savage played out of his mind, the rookie, who tried to change his number to 21, but had to pay too much, so can't make the 21 Savage joke. Rip. But he played out of his mind, really great. Adrian Amos obviously had a big play, but aside from the big play, did really well against the run. Tramon Williams, he was kind of up and down, but I would say at the end of the day, it was pretty good. So great stuff from the Packers defense. imagine saying this like 3 years ago. Yeah, the Packers offense, you got to wonder, is it going to ever be good? That defense, though, I better watch out.
Yeah, exactly. And let's end with a little bit of a laugh at the Lions, who
they lioned so hard.
So hard. And I had texted a buddy who's in Michigan. I usually reference whenever I reference the Lions, and they were the Lions had just kicked the field goal, and I had asked, "Are you nervous?" Nope, not nervous. Boy, all the Lions fan. Yep, and all the Lions fans I know today are all catatonic. Just, I don't understand exactly what just happened.
Well, they never built up the defense, and they were never exposed to the hopelessness virus.
Well, they never had hope.
Right, that's what I mean. I should say the hope virus. Right. Vikings fans, their instinct is to get nervous. Up 28-0, I guarantee you most Vikings fans are like, how's this going to happen?
Well, at 14 or at 14-0 going into the second half, I was sitting there just going, okay, we're only up 2 scores, and then we're up 21-0. Like, I'm still not sold here.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to see how this will screw up, right? Like, Vikings fans, they know, right, that there's always the possibility of disaster waiting around the corner, right? Lions fans, they haven't really been in this situation. In fact, Matthew Stafford, he had 8 comebacks 2 years ago, right? They've got the opposite problem, which is weird. They either are not in it at all, or somehow are eking it out as underdogs, right? They've never emotionally prepared themselves for having it taken away from them. The poor fools.
You believed, and that was your mistake. One of 2 things happened here. Either A, Arizona all of a sudden clicked, and we had said on the show when we were previewing the Arizona Vikings game.
That's right.
We had said that if and when this thing clicks, it will be dangerous. It did not click for 3 quarters and a half. And then all of a sudden, Kyler Murray started playing really well. So either one of 3 things happened. Either it clicked, and the teams in the NFC West should be afraid, or you got out coached, which not that big of a stretch. Or C, that defense was just on its heels and exhausted, and had absolutely nothing left by the end.
I think some of it's clicking. Like, I totally forgot that we were like, wow, this offense is going to suck until it suddenly doesn't. Like, it doesn't feel like a gradual, it's just going to click and then it's going to go. So I feel good about that. Thanks for reminding us of a win.
I do what I can.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, Lord knows we remind ourselves enough of our losses. But yeah, I would say, like, I think a lot of it is that the Arizona offense just like clicked for a bit, and they're beginning to really kind of figure out how it all coheres together. Plus, they decided to throw it to Larry Fitzgerald, so that's always helpful. But yeah, I mean, part of it's just like, I think there's an element of them being tired, but these players are like well conditioned. I mean, it's not like, Damon Harrison and Darius Slay haven't had their like fair share of like full 60-minute games where they've had to play to the end. So I think it's more that last thing, but also I wouldn't be surprised if the series of conservative calls by Patricia, because Patricia, I think, did a pretty poor job at the end of the game. Plus,
he destroyed it. Yeah. He called a timeout right before Matt Stafford was about to ice the game.
Yeah.
So you could immediately point to Patricia there and be like, yeah, this tie is a direct result of that one call.
Yeah, so this is the thing that's interesting to me. I think Lions fans are prepared for like random fuckery, right? Like the Calvin Johnson thing, the time they called back their own touchdown by challenging a play that was automatically reviewed, but then they got like a sportsman-like whatever penalty, the time that a clock runoff screwed them over. Like, they're prepared for that. They're just not prepared for being in the lead and just having it leak away as much as like a Vikings fan is.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was the part that was Lionsy. It was just like, wow, that was like so profoundly like you Orlovsky'd yourself out of the end zone. Like that's incredible. Wow.
What other team could possibly do this?
Right.
So we're going to go to the mailbag, and we have a whole mess of questions on Alexander. So I'm just going to hit the Alexander questions up with just one from Wes, who says, how will the Vikings address missing Alexander for the next few weeks?
It sounds like there's going to be a lot of J-Ron curse. That's going to be obviously a bigger problem against smaller, shiftier slot receivers, of which there are many. It's like the prototype of the slot. But it does mean that, you've got this like this person who's going to be pretty tremendous as a run defending nickel guy. But yeah, I mean, there's going to be a combination. Mike Hughes might come back right away. I mean, Mike Zimmer said earlier today that there's a chance that he could actually just be ready for week 2. And then the follow-up question, reporters were like, well, okay, so if he's, quote unquote, good to go, are you going to ease him in? And Zimmer was like, no, because he's been doing a ton of conditioning and a ton of like essentially football practice during rehab. If he's good to go, he's 100% good to go. He could play a whole game. Is essentially, I mean, Zimmer didn't say he could play a whole game, but essentially Zimmer communicated he could just play a whole game. So I think Hughes is going to be part of the solution potentially, next week. And if it's not, then obviously week 3 on. You have to rely on Marcus Epps a little bit, I think, in the nickel, although his last showing in nickel wasn't as tremendous as it was kind of early in the offseason. So that's part of it. And then, you might end up seeing Chris Boyd and Mark Fields out there, especially Mark Fields, who's more of an interior kind of nickel guy. That's obviously it's problematic, right? Because he's not super familiar with the defense, and the defense is really built on the communication and comfort that all these players have with each other. I think more so than a lot of defenses, like if you're a pure man coverage defense, like the amount of communication you have to do versus the type of pattern matching that the Vikings do, it's a lot different. You have to have a good feel for when those zone transitions work. And it was a problem he had in Kansas City. So that would be an issue, especially because we just discussed this problem of rookies coming in, struggling for like 2.5 years before finally getting it together. A problem that doesn't seem to apply to Mike Hughes, incidentally, because of the way Zimmer has talked about how quickly he's picked things up. So I'm much more optimistic about that. Plus, I mean, first round pick versus undrafted guy, all the reason in the world to be more optimistic. But I mean, that's a solution. But I wouldn't be surprised if they changed it from snap to snap based off of like the personnel. Like they could just say, hey, Curse, if they got 3 big guys and one of those big guys is going to be in the slot, you're out there. Or if they're in a down and distance where we know they run the ball, 80% of the time you're out there, right? Fields, if they've got kind of a speedy slot guy, get out there, right? Like that's going to be your job. And Epps, if they've got kind of a shiftier underneath guy that they're going to throw out there, that's your job, right? They might just change it from snap to snap or potentially drive to drive. So a lot of potential options. The ideal one, of course, is Mike Hughes.
Also, from Don from Ohio, with Mac's injury, doesn't it make more sense for Zimmer to bring Munnerlyn back more than ever? Boyd is not ready, nor is Hughes.
We don't know that Hughes isn't ready. And it sounds like he's once he's ready, he's just ready. So you can go what feels like 0 to 100, but really 90 to 100 with him. So that's really just a conversation that really relies on the knowledge we have medically of Hughes. I wouldn't be overly enthused about bringing Captain Munnerlyn in. And here's the thing. I wanted to bring him in like 3 weeks ago. So I'm not saying that I was kind of opposed to this idea. I just think that if we presuppose that the Vikings' assessment of the potential for Chris Boyd and Mark Fields are correct, and I'm a little skeptical of that, but if we suppose that, then exposing kind of one of them to get like 3 weeks of Captain Munnerlyn is kind of whatever. Plus, Brett Jones is going to come back very soon, maybe Wednesday, which is great news. And so you're already going to have to cut somebody. I don't know who. Maybe it's an offensive lineman. Maybe it's like Brandon Dillon, who actually had a pretty good game, so probably not. But, you're already cutting somebody, so bringing in captain, you have to cut somebody else. You get him for like 2 weeks. So maybe one. So I'm not super sold on that idea, in part because I'm like very optimistic based off of kind of what the team has been communicating to us about my cues.
Also from Don from Ohio, were you guys as shocked as I was that Vinatieri was the first kicker to miss an extra point this year?
Yeah, first.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. That he's in my mind, he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. So
I think he's a tremendously overrated kicker. Jason Lisk over at the Big Lead has a really strong invective-laden argument for why that's the case.
You and I have gone back and forth on this probably the entire length of the time that we've had the podcast as to whether or not Vinatieri is a Hall of Famer or whether or not he is his stats are overblown.
Right. But he is known to be good, right? Like regardless of if he's good, right? Like it doesn't
had
matter.
His absolute worst kicking day, according to him, on Sunday.
Maybe in his like life, right?
It's entirely possible. So,
although he did miss a game winner against Oakland, he was lucky to be able to get that one back. Anyway,
clearly not a Hall of Famer. Then.
I'm just saying, there's a line, buddy, and he's not first.
Okay. There are two people that I will get crap from, or crap about rather, when I talk about the Hall of Fame. One ends up being Devin Hester, and the other one being Adam Vinatieri.
You're pro Hester Hall of Fame, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so
we're on the same page here.
Yeah, so like there are two like cliffs, or there's two hills I'm willing to die on that, but. Yeah, the fact that he was the first one to miss is astonishing to me. Like, of all people, I was definitely not expecting that. And
I expected
as it turned
Boswell, but they didn't even get to kick an extra point.
Exactly. I was expecting Blair Walsh, but we didn't. Yeah,
right. Even you didn't even get to play. Or
because they went for it twice and they missed.
Or whoever the Chargers have this week.
Aww. All right, next question. Who go to Kyle Slaby, who asks, I saw a few instances of backup defensive linemen playing in a mini rotation, yet Everson Griffin was still out there when the game was out of reach. Why?
I don't know. I think it was a bad idea. The only player that seemed to have shelved early was Xavier Rhodes, so they like seemingly require a positive reason, an affirmative reason to take someone out after the game is over instead of like a precautionary reason. No, they should have had backups in. I would have put backups in maybe even at the beginning of the fourth quarter on both sides of the ball. Obviously, roster of like 46, but still.
I was a bit surprised that they kept putting Matt Ryan out there. Like, I really was just holding out hope that they were going to throw out the backup for Atlanta, whose name now escapes me for some reason.
Matt Schaub? I think it's Matt Schaub.
Maybe. But whoever the backup was.
I don't think anyone ever called Matt in his life.
Well, probably not.
It is Matt Schaub.
How about that? Yeah, like Matt Schaub. I know they had mentioned that Matt Schaub was warming up on the sidelines, so it was like, okay, well, if he does that, the game is officially over, and we can take this.
Maybe it's like a game of chicken. No one wanted to admit that the game was over first.
Maybe the Vikings were clearly waiting for a sign,
right?
Like if they pulled Matt Ryan, there's no way that Everson Griffin was going to play the rest of that game,
right? But yeah, I would have pulled at least the vets and the super high value players. So I would have pulled Everson. I would have pulled Daniil, who's probably the only young player I would have pulled. I would have definitely pulled Harrison Smith. Obviously Xavier Rhodes, who they did pull. I maybe would have kept Anthony Harris. I would have pulled Anthony Barr. I would have definitely put in Eric Wilson and Ben Gedeon. The whole backup defensive line, obviously. It would have been like I would keep Trey Waynes. If Mackenzie Alexander was healthy, I would have kept him in maybe. But yeah, like I would have kept maybe 3 or 4 players at least halfway through the fourth quarter is probably the point where I'd just be like, all right.
Like at this point, garbage time touchdowns are just going to happen.
Yeah, the starting offensive line, you can stay. You got some stuff to work out. Everyone else.
Also from Slaby, was Kirk's mustache the reason why the coaching staff didn't trust him to throw more than a Tavares Jackson era game plan?
I think his facial hair is better than him clean shaven.
Is it better than Aaron Rodgers' mustache?
Unquestionable. That's not even close. That's not a fair comparison at all. Would you rather have an ugly doll or Chucky?
Well, one of them's gonna disappoint my whole family. So that will never get old to me. Brian Jellerson asks, it seems like we're still susceptible to late game drives with these 15 to 20 yard passes down the middle of the field, especially when the score is just enough for us to get comfortable. Is this due to scheme changes or do we just get complacent? It seems like this happened a lot last year too.
I think some of it's kind of just regression, right? The teams that do poorly enough to allow huge leads, the talent differential in the NFL is never that much. And so generally speaking, they'll play better because they are better. So I think that's part of it. I think we sometimes forget that they get to make adjustments too, and so they do. And sometimes you don't really catch up. So those two things are kind of at play. I do know that Zimmer is worried about complacency fairly constantly. I think he'll even say or call out complacency, just not to just call it out, but just to be careful in case it was complacency. So I think that's part of it. I don't think they tend to change schematically what they do as much as I think people think, especially because Zimmer seems to go and prevent a lot less than a lot of other defensive coordinators do. So I think sometimes it just happens because it happens.
Also, how sustainable is this offense? I know Kirk isn't going to have sub 100 yard passing stats every game, but can this scheme transition easily to more passing plays if we face a defense that can stop our running game?
I don't know what sustainable means in this context. Like, no, but in all the obvious ways that you definitely aren't asking, right? Like, you already admit that. I mean, Kirk's not going to average 140 passer rating for the entire season. Although, I mean, if he does, feel free to play this clip back at me. They're not going to average, over 5, maybe over 7 yards a carry on the ground. They're not going to throw the ball only 10 times. So we those are all obvious, right? So I don't know exactly what to say about what parts of the offense. Is the run game going to be good? I think so. I think it is much more variable than we initially expect. There's a bunch of different types of interesting zone runs that they do: split zone, inside zone, outside zone, wide zone, which is apparently different because of the way that they cap the defensive end. Counter, they do power type stuff with pulling guards, pin and pulls. So there's a lot more to that offensive line and the run scheme than I thought. And that creates a lot of interesting opportunities to craft kind of better run games for what you do well. So I do think the run game is going to improve. And generally speaking, Kubiak has been involved with teams where the run game has been much better with him than without him. But I don't think any part of the passing offense has been indicative of what we're going to see going forward. I mean, I broke down one of the passing plays, the Adam Thielen touchdown. And it was like a classic West Coast concept, like a drive concept with a couple of different things on the backside. We're going to see West Coast passing stuff, I guess. I don't know. But I expect good things. I don't know if the good things are reflected in this game.
Or at least not yet, anyway.
Right.
Next question is from Raul, who says, it is said that running the football limits the number of possessions per game. Does evidence-based football confirm that? I suppose you could look at the fact that a running clock is more likely to cause less possessions than a stopped clock.
Yeah, but the clock only stops on an incomplete pass like the final 5 minutes of a half. So running the ball does take longer, but not appreciably longer. So the evidence, so I asked Ben Baldwin this, the running doesn't matter truther, about reducing possession. So I asked him a set of essentially paired questions. So if you're the underdog, it behooves you to reduce the number of possessions in a game, right? Because the more possessions that exist, the more chances your superior opponent gets to prove that they are superior, right? You want high variance strategies because that's going to help you. So you want to reduce the number of possessions in the game. But the tension here is that running the ball is a low variance activity that on average is poor anyway. So you want high variance downfield passes, and high variance downfield passes don't run the clock very much. So I was like, with that context in mind, is it better to run the ball more often, reduce the number of possessions, and increase variance by limiting the number of drives where you get to compete directly with your opponent? Or is it better to just throw the ball downfield a lot and be content with like 3-second drives or whatever and have a lot of possessions? And he took a look at it, and the first hypothesis he tested was, does running the ball more reduce the number of possessions? And the answer is no. And that, if you look back at the teams that have had the fewest number of drives per game, that kind of matches up. So the two teams that have stood out over the years as having remarkably few drives per game are the Carolina Panthers, who do run the ball a lot. That kind of makes sense. And the Los Angeles Chargers. Doesn't make as much sense. And it's because what you do before the snap determines how long your plays are going to take from play to play, more than the type of play you choose. Because the difference between a pass and a run is like maybe 4 seconds. The difference between a hurry up and just a slow grind them out clock is 30 seconds of play. So that's the key. It's how you manage your in-between snaps and not your play selection historically. The evidence really strongly suggests that running the ball does not run the clock any more than passing the ball. And then the second part of that, and this is really important, if you run the ball more often, you're less likely to get first downs. And if you don't get first downs, you have to give the ball back. And so that increases the number of possessions way more than your ability to waste 6 more seconds running the ball.
Well, I feel like I learned something today. It's actual like hard-hitting analysis there.
I'm sorry.
We're going to have to start charging for this.
I'll do better next time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Deckmet asks, in your opinion, what is the wins above replacement ratio between Cook and Madison, Boone, and Abdullah?
I don't know what I suppose I could just do it quickly in my head, I guess. Is the ratio like just a little bit above 1? I think Cook is like tremendously talented. I think he's underrated in terms of his pure talent. I think he's one of the more talented backs in the NFL. And I think any way that you can measure running back talent, which is a very difficult thing to do using statistics, I, in fact, would argue that it is better to evaluate the pure talent of a runner with film over stats, but that doesn't matter because talent doesn't get expressed into production. And the reason it's better to evaluate talent from film over stats is because talent doesn't translate into production. And so it doesn't appear in a lot of statistics. That's not to say there aren't obvious talent differences. Matt Asiata is unquestionably worse than prime Adrian Peterson. And that was reflected in production. So Adrian Peterson's wins above replacement, assuming a replacement level back is like Matt Asiata, or like a Ben Tate maybe is a good example because he was actually a street free agent. That's a lot. Like I would say that Adrian Peterson was worth 2.5, maybe 3 wins in the 2012 season over like a replacement back or something like that. Dalvin Cook versus specifically Alexander Madison, and you could throw Amir Abdullah and Mike Boone in there. Maybe half a win. That's stretching it. So I don't know what the ratio would be, because if Mike Boone is worth 0.01 wins above replacement or 0.2 wins above replacement at the best, then if it's then I don't know, the ratio could be dramatically different between the two. So the answer, whatever the answer is, it's irrelevant.
Well, all right then. Eddie asks, was Elfline as bad as he looked from my couch? And if so, how much improvement do you need to see over what course of time before you believe it would be irresponsible to continue starting him? Also, can the cliched offensive line continuity to contributing to improvement talk?
So chemistry is like, or continuity essentially allows you to reach your potential as an offensive lineman, right? Like, good offensive linemen become pretty good offensive linemen become very good, and very good offensive linemen become great, and great offensive linemen become phenomenal, right? Like, which, the way I describe that, those are fairly marginal gains each way, right? So,
right.
And obviously that's just my opinion, right? Like, you talk to offensive line coaches and they'll say something much stronger than that. But I don't think you can perform significantly above your own talent level from the inclusion of continuity. We did see some of the impact of a lack of continuity on how Laramie Tunsil played against the Saints tonight on Monday. He made a number of errors, and offensive linemen are evaluated on a very small number of errors, a very small percentage of snaps. Remember, I said that if you miss out on 9% of your pass blocking snaps, you're the worst offensive lineman in the NFL. 6% is pretty bad. Zero continuity clearly turns a very good offensive lineman, Laramie Tunsil, into a pretty below average offensive lineman. But there's a cap to how much continuity can help you, obviously. And it only improves who you are at your kind of your base core. And I think there's really good evidence that Pat Elflein is just not very good. So how long is it before it is irresponsible? -1 games. I think it is irresponsible. If I were conservative or optimistic about Pat Elflein improving, I'd say 3 games. 3 more games. So wait until the end of week 4. And then, of course, you're like, oh, yeah, we got to find out if he can shut down Akeem Hicks and Kenny Clark. So then we'll know, right? I am more risk averse than that. Or maybe not risk averse. I'm more worried. I shouldn't say risk averse, because I would bring in a relatively unknown quantity like Brett Jones. But yeah, I would say it's kind of irresponsible. I don't think the continuity. Plus, I mean, like, how much continuity are you losing with Brett Jones? Like, he's been in the locker room. He knows the offense as well as anybody else. He's played alongside a lot of these guys, right? So how much continuity are you losing? Playing guard instead of center would be a pretty significant change, and that could create some pretty short-term problems, significant short-term problems. But I mean, I would still do it now.
Hunter asks 2 questions. One is, was the Vikings' success on defense more of a factor of turnovers stalling out what looked like scoring drives, or did the success come from a more sustainable source?
Yes. I think that the Vikings are fundamentally a sustainable defense. They do a great job, especially on third down, and that's proven to be sustainable for them, especially given that they've got just incredible continuity on the defense, as well as with the coordinator. But I would say the specific stuff that worked out for them is pretty unsustainable. I don't expect them to get 2 picks and a fumble recovery every game. So I would say their ability to stall drives is sustainable. Their ability to produce the way that they did, put the offense in the field position that they did, and end drives early as opposed to just force them to punt, is probably not sustainable. The design of the defense inhibits turnover production. That's something that's become pretty clear over the years. Not the talent. The players are talented enough to generate turnovers, but the design prevents it in a lot of ways. And turnovers just generally are very difficult to sustain, which we've talked about like ad nauseum on the show. So, I think they're sustainable, but I think it's in the way that they continue to force punts going forward.
Yeah, if you're looking at a whole thing on whether or not the turnovers end up being sustainable, you end up looking at the Vikings from 2 years ago and going, wow, they were great down the stretch, and then they couldn't get any turnovers, and that was the end of their year. Like, it ends up turning into that sort of situation. Also, let's do a little game of real and not real. Packers defense, real or not real?
Mostly real.
Mostly real.
Yeah, I think they're good. I've been talking about how Mike Pettin is going to turn that remarkably talented group of individual defenders into a cohesive unit, maybe a year too soon. But I strongly believe in Mike Pettin's history as a defensive coordinator. He has been a remarkable defensive coordinator. And I also happen to think that the Packers have a lot more talent on defense than has been produced in terms of the points per game total. So I figured that was going to cohere at some point. But I mean, you're not going to always be able to play against Mitch Trubisky. So
truth, and which is also going to lead us to the second question of Dak Prescott and the play action heavy Cowboys.
Are they real or not real?
Are they real or not real, considering they're playing the Giants?
I can't believe you would impugn Pat Shurmur. So, I would, I would say, so this is the first thing that came to, and maybe it's because I'm a nerd. No, it's definitely because I'm a nerd. No, maybe. The first thing that came to mind was everyone complaining to the Madden ratings guys that Dallas had like the 4th or 5th highest team in overall team rating. And I was like, well, that's like interesting. Like, is Dallas a great team? Probably not. Is this what a great team looks like against a bad team? Yes. So the heuristic I use for like, the Ravens blowing out Miami or the Cowboys just whipping on the Giants is, what would an average team do against a bad team? What would a good team do against a bad team? What would a great team do against a bad team? And if we look at it from that perspective, a great team would do what the Cowboys did. That's not to say they are great, but I think that reframes it in a way that gives them, I think, more deserved latitude on that question. I don't think they're going to sustain that level of production. I think they're going to be a good team.
And finally, real or not real, Christian McCaffrey being the best weapon in the league.
Not real. What? No. Well, first we just saw Alvin before this question, or after this question was submitted. We just saw Alvin Kamara do some nasty work. But I mean, like, Christian McCaffrey is a top 5 quote unquote weapon, but like Saquon Barkley is better, Alvin Kamara is better to the extent that matters. See previous discussion on running backs. But like, if we want to talk about like just like pure weapons, not just like running backs who could do a lot of stuff, it might be Tyreek Hill. Right. Deshaun Jackson kind of proved that he still has, that threat capability within him. Julio, when he's not against the Vikings, DeAndre Hopkins, he had a rare night where he had a couple of drops. He didn't drop any passes last year at all. And he proved to be a pretty reliable weapon. Will Fuller. Those are guys I would say are much more interesting and dynamic weapons than Christian McCaffrey, who I would say is not even number 1 among running backs.
Yeah. Damian Barrett asks the one question where we're going to discuss. We're going to be discussing AB on this. So, as a fan of European soccer, the concept of tapping up has long been established, or has been a long established means of getting a player to transfer away from a team. Does AB getting a move to the Pats suggest that this might become more common in the NFL? I will say that if European soccer features the like not a Nike ad as a way of and like not exactly secretly taping your coach when apparently you got his permission to do so, like I would watch more European soccer. I think I'd be down for the drama.
The European soccer has a lot of drama. I think you probably enjoy the sheer amount of drama.
It already has a high body count, so
okay, yeah, that's true. So tapping up, I think, is just tampering. That's going to continue to be rare, I think. The Antonio Brown stuff is like bizarre. It was a unique exercise of labor power from players, but it happens to concern an individual laborer, an individual player whose services are remarkably valuable. So it's like I don't expect, Melvin Gordon to be able to do the same thing. I don't expect Mike Boone to be able to do that sort of thing. So there's like a lot of player power that is required for tampering like this to really work out, if it is in fact tampering. Like, I wouldn't be shocked if the Patriots actually didn't tamper and Antonio Brown just like organized this whole thing to be free and then just choose who he wants, which includes the Patriots, who did try to trade for him.
I did read on Twitter that this did feel exactly like the episode of Seinfeld where the Mets told George to get fired from the Yankees.
Right.
Like, it did reek of that a bit.
I mean, you can't help but feel it's the Patriots, right? Why do they deserve the benefit of the doubt? But like, and you can't even say like, at least they cheat well. I mean, they get caught a lot. I mean, they win. They do get caught a lot. So it's not like they cheat well. I don't. When they attempt to cheat, there's always like something that makes you go, oh, I get it. That's kind of clever, right? Like, oh, deflated footballs. Is that the reason behind the fumble, whatever luck that they always seem to have? Which, I mean, probably not, but like, interesting. That's covert. That's like difficult to figure out. You said
maybe Belichick was just into his video editing skills or his recording skills.
Right, yeah. Oh, you set up cameras the wrong part of the end zone. Like, okay, honest mistake, or whatever. It's just a camera, right? You can just hide it. But like, this is just like, if they pull your emails, you're screwed. Like that's not particularly clever or elegant. They did, I guess, tamper to get Bill Belichick in the first place from the Jets, but since then, I mean, I feel like they've run a tighter operation. So,
yeah, let's go with that.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if it was like the Patriots tampered for Antonio Brown breaking. I'd be like, okay, fine, I was wrong. That makes sense. But I don't think so.
Corey Rug asks, if the entire Viking season is a Thanksgiving and this game was the first dish served from the kitchen, which dish is it? Well, what do we expect from the rest of the meal? Food and beverages analogies only, please. It's like he knows this. It's like he knows this show.
So, which dish is this game, and what dishes can we prepare for?
I think that he's trying to set you up for what are you going to cook this year for Thanksgiving that's not turkey again.
I thought he was setting me up for define which game is turkey.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
Because if that's the case, it's got to be the Chicago Bears game. I'm not super interested in it going forward. In order for the Vikings to pull it off, they have to like thread this needle, because it's possible. It's possible to make good turkey. It's possible to...
You would be welcome to the surprise of it working out.
Yeah, see, exactly.
However,
and I would say, were I to choose an opponent / meal, it wouldn't be that. Especially in Chicago, in either case.
In either case, yes. As far as the first dish was concerned, this had like the homemade bread kind of feel to it. Like it came just like right out of the oven, and you had the butter ready for it. Like, slather a little bit of on. Like, yep. This is a good start. We got the good dinner rolls are out tonight.
I'm wondering if like this game was so good, it was like you were at the King's Hawaiian factory. So it's not just freshly baked bread, but like freshly baked King's Hawaiian rolls, which no one's ever had, right? Like, I don't think they sell to bake King's Hawaiian rolls. So,
no,
but I imagine
you would have
that's
to be at the
heavenly.
factory. Maybe the secret of that whole flavor is just based entirely on the weird plastic and the weird like rectangle square or the weird square that they put all the bread on. It's absorbing
certainly
something from
possible.
that.
I can't profess to know the secret. I think it's pineapple juice, but who knows?
Who knows? Brad asks, is there anything predictive we can say about winning the first game of the season in terms of probability of getting into the playoffs?
Not a small amount, but not a ton. Apparently, if you lose the first 2 games, your season's just over. It's very hard to make the playoffs if you lose the first 2 games. I don't actually like that framing. So this is how Justice Mosqueda puts it. If you lose the first 2 games, you're out of the playoffs. I don't like that because it's really teams that lose the first 2 games are not good enough to dig themselves out of the hole because they're the type of team who will lose 2 of any given game, right? So that's usually what it means. But Justice, per usual, takes it to this insane level where he's like, well, you don't want to have an away game against the Broncos early in the season because the Broncos are like crazy good at home in September, like kind of regardless of era, because you'll lose one of your games. And if you drop your other game, you're out of the playoffs. And it's like, well, it's not, the losing isn't like, it's only 1/16 of the reason, right? Like the reason is because you're not good enough to win, like generally, because you're not a good team. And if you picked 2 random games, apparently you lost them. So that's not the reason. But Justice is like, it's math. So he's crazy per usual. Let him know I said that.
Probably knocking over something that he's passing off as a lamp of some kind.
Right, yeah.
Why do all of your lamps have water in them? I don't I don't get that choice by the design.
Strange noises. But yeah, I mean statistically your odds are better than like 60% if you win the first game. But I would say that that's like a product of being the type of team that wins, a game picked at random. So first 2 games, you've got a better sense of the trajectory of the team, good enough to know that in all likelihood, whether or not you're a team that is talented enough to take what you have, which is 1/8 of the season, and invest it towards getting into the playoffs.
Final question is also from Brad, who says, since Arif is an expert on Pokemon and parenting, I need some advice on the best way to store Pokemon cards.
I'm not an expert on Pokemon. Someone just... So, anecdote, not even that funny, but I'm going to say it anyway. So someone tweeted out the transaction report that lists Antonio Brown as having signed to the New England Patriots. And I thought that was kind of funny because it's got like 3 transactions on it and there's nothing special about any of them. And so it's like John Wetzel signs with the Atlanta Falcons. He's from this college, right? Antonio Brown signed to the New England Patriots. He's from the Central Michigan, right? And so it's just like so bland and matter of fact. And it's like with these 2 other players whose names you're just not really familiar with. Right. And so I just thought that was like really funny. And given like the context of all the drama surrounding Antonio Brown, the thing that makes it official is just so mundane, in fact, that it's included with just a couple of other random street free agents. Right. So I tweet that out and someone was like, John Wetzel, his name sounds like a Pokemon. And I was like, I agree. He sounds like a middle evolution. And someone tweeted a picture of a Pokemon at me. And I was like, I've never seen that thing in my life. What is that? It was a Pokemon, it turns out. So I go to the Bulbapedia. So it's got all the Pokemon on it. Well, I sounded old as hell when I said that.
Congratulations on the oldest thing you'll likely say today.
Yeah, I went to the Facebook and they didn't even have the MTV. But yeah, I went to Bulbapedia. It has all the Pokemon. And I control F'd TZEL because I figured it was a name reference, and it was a water type Pokemon. So Wetzel. It was actually very surprising. It's like Stormsoul or something. It's like a water type. So it is, so I'm not an expert at Pokemon. Anyway, I told you the story wasn't funny. But it proves I'm not an expert at Pokemon. Now, to answer your question, which actually has nothing to do with being an expert at Pokemon and more has to do with the fact that we've got like 1,000 Magic cards. Honestly, if you're not concerned about organization, shoeboxes are fine. If you are concerned about organization, there's like some really slick organizational schema that are sold by like, comic book shops and trading card shops, like The Source, for example, that do a really great job of allowing you to craft an organizational system inside these boxes that are fairly sturdy. They are a lot like shoe boxes because at the end of the day, you're storing playing cards in a box. And then obviously decks, then when you've constructed a deck, you've got your own deck box. So I would recommend that.
When I was growing up, we had basketball cards and football cards and baseball cards that
when I was growing up, we had basketball cards with real people on them.
Exactly. None of this fake stuff like now. It's where you have like the Space Jam All-Stars or something. We had real players like Horace Grant on our basketball cards. And I'm not going to... Yeah,
We had the players with heart like Tony Kukoc.
We had Christian Leitner, and we were damn happy to have him. Boy, all right. So that'll be the oldest thing I say today. But I had numerous actual binders. But after a while, there were enough cards where I was like, okay, well, we're just gonna take this Hillshire Farms red plastic container that would have the meat in it for sandwich meat or whatever, and we are just going to put your cards in here after we wash it, and you can just have this and it's going to be sealed and it'll be fine. You can just have your loose cards in here and the cards you actually care about over in the actual binder. If you have a child who is 6 and only likes specific cards probably, or thinks they're pretty cool looking, you're probably better off just getting the meat container or the Tupperware thing and just making sure he puts them in there before bed every night, so you don't have them sitting on the bottom of your foot every time you walk through the goddamn living room. I may have experienced that recently. So that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code and apparently Dad Corner. Arif, what do you have to plug over at The Athletic? Yeah,
so I broke down 4 plays from the first 13 snaps of the game that defined the Vikings' dominance over the Falcons. So offensive play, offensive passing play, offensive rushing play, a special teams play, but you can't guess which one, and a defensive play. So yeah, head over there. Really proud of it. A bunch of X's and O's stuff, diagrammed, talked about some of the changes in the running game that I was surprised to see, talked about kind of the coverage principles that were used, and some of that West Coast offense stuff I mentioned earlier in the episode.
All right, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. We will return later this week to break down the matchup against Green Bay. That'll be happening in Lambeau on Sunday. So that'll be it for this episode. Again, my name is James. Thank you from Arif. From all of us at Norse Code, again, thank you so much. And please remember that revenge is a dish best served funky as hell. And we will see you later this week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, people hit people in the mouth.